Folks, I want to talk with you today about something that happened these past weeks, something that may not have dominated every headline, but something that could shape the future of American democracy for years to come. On June 29th and June 30th, the United States Supreme Court issued a series of decisions that, taken together, represent one of the most significant moments for American governance in modern history. Now, I've spent enough years in public service to know that politics often moves in cycles. Some weeks feel dramatic in the moment but are quickly forgotten. Others seem ordinary at first, yet history later recognizes them as turning points. I believe this was one of those turning points. During my 8 years in the Oval Office, I learned many lessons about how our constitutional system works. Perhaps the most important lesson was that no single person, not even the President of the United States, is supposed to control every part of government. Our founders intentionally designed a system of checks and balances. Congress checks the President. The courts check both Congress and the President. Elections allow the American people to check everyone. That system isn't perfect. It can be slow. It can be frustrating. Sometimes it produces compromise when people want quick action. But that's the point. Democracy isn't supposed to make power easy. It's supposed to make power accountable. This week, we watched that system being tested once again. Over the course of just 48 hours, the Supreme Court handed down several major rulings touching on voting rights, executive authority, campaign, finance, and constitutional protections. At the same time, Republican senators publicly resisted pressure from President Donald Trump on legislation he considers essential. His agenda. 40. What's remarkable is that many of these setbacks did not come from political opponents. They came from institutions that President Trump himself helped shape. 3 of the 9 Supreme Court justices were appointed by Donald Trump during his first term. Yet several of the court's most important rulings went directly against his wishes. At the same time, members of his own party refused to eliminate the Senate filibuster to pass one of his highest priority election bills. That matters because it reminds us of something larger than politics. Our institutions still retain the ability, at least in some circumstances, to push back against concentrated power. Before we discuss each decision, let's understand the political environment surrounding these events. Donald Trump is now serving the second year of his second term. His administration faces growing political pressure from multiple directions. National polling averages place his approval rating around 40%, while a majority of Americans disapprove of his job performance. Historically, presidents entering midterm elections with approval ratings this low often face significant electoral losses. The country also finds itself dealing with several difficult challenges. Americans continue to struggle with high living costs. Consumer confidence remains weak. Gasoline prices have stayed elevated for months. A recent government shutdown disrupted federal services, frustrating millions of families and businesses. Internationally, the administration is managing an unpopular military engagement with Iran that Congress never formally authorized. Questions about executive authority, foreign policy, and constitutional limits have become central topics of public debate. Meanwhile, the 2026 midterm elections are only a few months away. Republicans currently control both the House of Representatives and the Senate. Those majorities are extremely narrow. In the House, only a handful of seats separate Republicans from Democrats. In the Senate, leadership depends upon maintaining near-perfect party unity. The political reality makes every disagreement inside the Republican Party enormously important. Against this backdrop came one of the busiest weeks the Supreme Court has experienced in years. The first major ruling involved election law. In Watson v. Republican National Committee, the court considered whether states may count absentee ballots that are mailed before Election Day but arrive several days afterward. Mississippi law allows ballots postmarked by Election Day to be counted if they arrive within 5 days. Critics argued that federal law requires all ballots to be received by Election Day itself. The Supreme Court disagreed by a narrow 5-4 vote. The court upheld Mississippi's law. Perhaps the biggest surprise wasn't simply the outcome. It was who wrote the majority opinion. Justice Amy Coney Barrett, appointed by Donald Trump, concluded that federal election statutes establish when voters must cast their ballots, but they do not explicitly require election officials to receive every ballot on that same day. Joining Barrett were Chief Justice John Roberts, along with Sonia Sotomayor, Elena Kagan, and Ketanji Brown Jackson. For supporters of mail-in voting, the decision represented an important affirmation that states retain flexibility in administering elections fairly. For President Trump, who has repeatedly criticized mail-in voting, the ruling represented a significant defeat. Almost immediately after the decision, he publicly condemned it, arguing that it would undermine election integrity. Yet, regardless of one's political views, the court's decision demonstrated something fundamental about judicial independence. The justices were not voting according to the preferences of the president who appointed them. They were interpreting the law as they understood it. That distinction is essential in any constitutional democracy. On the same day, the court quietly announced another decision that attracted enormous public attention. The justices declined to hear President Trump's appeal concerning the civil lawsuit brought by writer Jin Kerol. Earlier proceedings had resulted in a jury finding Trump liable for sexual abuse and defamation, awarding Kerol $5 million in damages. By refusing to hear the appeal, the Supreme Court effectively allowed the lower court's judgment to stand. No justice publicly dissented. No further appeal remained available. Whether Americans agreed or disagreed with the jury's verdict, the legal process had reached its conclusion. The nation's highest court signaled that it saw no compelling constitutional issue requiring further review. That's shame day. However, the court also issued a decision with Farich consequences in the opposite direction in Trump v. Slaughter. The justices voted 6-3 to expend presidential authority over independent federal agencies for nearly a century. A landmark precedent known as Humphrey's executor had limited a presidente ability to remove commissioners serving on independent regulatory bodies, such as the Federal Trade Commission. The court overturned that precedent. As a result, presidents now possess significantly greater authority to dismiss leaders of numerous independent agencies across the federal government. Supporters argue this strengthens democratic accountability by ensuring executive officials answer directly to the elected president. Critics warn that it weakens the independence of institutions, specifically designed to operate free from day-to-day political pressure. Either way, the decision represents one of the largest shifts in presidential power in decades, and it was only the beginning of an extraordinary week. The political reaction that followed would become just as significant as the rulings themselves. President Trump responded publicly and forcefully. On social media, he criticized several of the court's decisions, arguing that they would damage election integrity and weaken his administration's efforts to reform immigration policy behind closed doors. However, an even more dramatic confrontation was unfolding. Only days before the court announced its rulings, President Trump had canceled the signing ceremony for a major bipartisan housing bill. The legislation had received overwhelming bipartisan support in Congress. It passed the House of Representatives by a vote of 358-32 and cleared the Senate with an overwhelming margin of 85-5. Ordinarily, legislation receiving that level of bipartisan agreement would be celebrated as an example of government working across party lines. Instead, the bill became leverage in a broader political dispute. President Trump announced that he would not sign the housing package until Congress passed the SAVE Act, a Republican-backed election bill that would require documentary proof of citizenship for voting in federal elections. His message was unmistakable until lawmakers delivered one legislative priority. Another unrelated piece of legislation would remain on hold. The decision surprised many members of Congress, including Republicans who had worked for months negotiating the housing bill. Too many observers. The episode reflected an increasingly confrontational approach to governing. Presidents often use political pressure to advance their agendas. That is nothing new. What made this episode different was the willingness to delay broadly supported legislation affecting housing simply to gain leverage on an unrelated issue. Soon afterward, President Trump met privately with Senate Republicans. According to several senators who later spoke with reporters, the meeting was tense from beginning to end. Discussion quickly turned toward the SAVE Act, Senate rules, and the legislative filibuster. The president reportedly urged Republican senators to eliminate the filibuster, if necessary, to pass his election legislation. Several senators resisted. They argued that Senate rules existed to protect minority rights and preserve institutional stability, regardless of which party controlled Congress. Others pointed out that the vote simply did not exist. Senate Majority Leader John Thune publicly acknowledged the political reality. "We've got to deal with the real world," he said, emphasizing that governing requires working within the limits of available votes rather than demanding impossible outcomes. Senator Tom Tillis offered perhaps the sharpest criticism. He argued that the Senate is an independent branch of government, not a manufacturing department expected to automatically produce whatever legislation the White House requests. Those comments were remarkable not because Democrats made them, but because they came from members of the president's own party. Senator Bill Cassidy also described the heated exchange during the meeting, saying he believed legitimate. Questions about legislation should not be treated as acts of disloyalty. Other Republican senators emphasized, afterward, that party unity cannot be built through pressure alone. Successful governing requires persuasion, compromise, and mutual respect between institutions. These disagreements revealed an important constitutional principle that is often overlooked during highly polarized political debates. The president is powerful, but the presidency was never designed to command Congress. The Constitution intentionally separates legislative and executive authority. Members of Congress answer first to their own constituents, not to the president. Likewise, federal judges answer to the Constitution, not to the political leaders who appointed them. These structural protections exist for a reason. The framers understood that concentrating too much authority in one office creates risks for democratic government. Checks and balances may slow this, but they also reduce the likelihood that temporary political majorities can permanently reach constitutional rights without broader national consensus. That is precisely why the events of this week attracted such widespread attention. In only a few days, Americans witnessed each branch of government asserting its own constitutional role. The Supreme Court limited executive authority in some areas while expanding it in others. The Senate resisted pressure to change long-standing procedural rules. The president responded by intensifying his public campaign for legislative action. Whether one supported or opposed any particular ruling, the broader lesson remained clear. American democracy depends not only on elections, but also on institutions that are willing to operate independently, even when doing so creates political conflict. The tension between the branches of government is not necessarily evidence that democracy is failing. In many ways, it is evidence that the constitutional system continues to function exactly as it was designed, through disagreement, negotiation, and limits on concentrated power. As the nation moves closer to the 2026 midterm elections, these institutional struggles are likely to shape not only the political landscape, but also the future balance of power between the presidency, Congress, and the courts. As important as this week's headlines may be, the larger story is not about a single court case or one political confrontation. It is about the long-term direction of American democracy. Court decisions come and go, presidents enter and leave office, and congressional majorities change. But some rulings reshape the rules of government for generations. That is why the consequences of this week deserve careful attention. One of the biggest concerns raised by legal scholars involves the changing balance of power between the executive branch and independent federal agencies. For decades, agencies such as the Federal Trade Commission, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, the Consumer Product Safety Commission, and several others were intentionally structured to operate with a degree of political independence. Congress believed that certain regulatory decisions should be guided by expertise and long-term stability rather than short-term political pressure. The Supreme Court's decision expanding presidential authority over these agencies marks a significant constitutional shift. Supporters argue that independent agencies exercise enormous power and therefore should ultimately answer to the president, who is elected by the American people. In their view, democratic accountability requires executive control. Critics see the issue differently. They worry that removing those protections allows future presidents, regardless of party to replace, experienced officials simply because they disagreed politically. Over time, agencies designed to provide objective oversight could become increasingly partisan. This debate extends far beyond one administration. Every future president will inherit the expanded powers created by these decisions. Whether those powers are used responsibly will depend not only on the law, but also on the character of those who hold office. Another issue receiving enormous attention involves voting rights. For decades, The Voting Rights Act stood as one of the most important achievements of the civil rights movement. It helped protect minority communities from discrimination in elections and ensured broader participation in American democracy. Recent court decisions have altered how portions of that law are interpreted and enforced. Supporters argue that states deserve greater flexibility in drawing legislative districts and administering elections. They believe local governments are better positioned to make those decisions than federal courts. Opponents fear those changes could weaken protections for minority voters and reduce fair representation in Congress, regardless of one's political position. Few would disagree that the right to vote lies at the heart of democratic government. Every change affecting election law deserves careful public debate, because those decisions influence who participates in democracy and whose voices are ultimately heard. Campaign finance represents another area undergoing profound transformation. Recent rulings expanding coordinated spending between political parties and candidates will likely increase the amount of money flowing into federal elections. Supporters contend that political speech deserves strong constitutional protection, and that limiting campaign spending may also limit free expression. Critics argue that unlimited financial influence risks giving wealthy donors and special interests disproportionate access to elected officials. Both perspectives raise difficult constitutional questions that Americans will continue debating for years. Taken together, these developments suggest that the nation is entering a new chapter in the relationship between political power, constitutional rights, and democratic institutions. At the same time, the political calendar continues moving forward. The 2026 midterm elections now loom over every decision made in Washington. Historically, midterm elections often serve as a referendum on the sitting president. If economic conditions remain difficult, if public dissatisfaction continues, and if political divisions deepen, Republicans could face significant electoral challenges. Democrats believe those conditions create an opportunity to regain control of the House of Representatives and possibly narrow the Republican advantage in the Senate. Should that occur, Congress would likely become even more divided. Legislative negotiations would become more complicated. Oversight hearings would increase, and many of President Trump's priorities could face greater resistance. But elections alone do not solve national problems. Winning political power is only the beginning. Effective governing requires presenting practical solutions on issues Americans confront everyday: housing affordability, healthcare costs, education, national security, inflation, and economic opportunity. Citizens expect more than partisan conflict. They expect results. That is also another possible scenario. Rather than adjusting strategy, President Trump could continue escalating confrontations with both Congress and the courts. If disagreements within the Republican Party become more frequent, governing could become increasingly difficult. Despite holding congressional majority, history shows that internal party divisions often prove more challenging than opposition from the other side. Political coalitions remain successful only when they maintain enough unity to govern effectively. If lawmakers begin prioritizing institutional independence over party loyalty, future legislative battles may become even more unpredictable. Yet beyond elections and political strategy lies a larger constitutional question. What kind of presidency does America want for the future? Every expansion of executive authority established today becomes available to future presidents tomorrow. Every limitation removed today affects administrations of both political parties. That is why constitutional debates should never focus solely on the individual currently occupying the Oval Office. They must also consider the precedents being established for generations yet to come. The strength of the American system has never depended upon perfect leaders. It depends upon strong institutions, independent courts, responsible legislatures, a free press, and citizens willing to participate in public life. Democracy survives not because conflict disappears, but because constitutional rules provide peaceful ways to resolve those conflicts. As the United States approaches the 250th anniversary of its independence, Americans have reason both for concern and for optimism. Concern because constitutional institutions face serious tests unlike those seen in many years. Optimism because those same institutions continue demonstrating resilience even during periods of intense political disagreement. The Supreme Court issued decisions that pleased some Americans and disappointed others. Congress asserted its own authority despite pressure from the executive branch. Public debate continues vigorously across the country. Those developments remind us that democracy remains an ongoing project, rather than a finished achievement. Ultimately, the future will not be determined solely by judges, senators, presidents, or political parties. It'll be determined by citizens, by people who stay informed, by people who participate in elections, by people willing to hold every public official accountable, regardless of party affiliation. Democracy asks something of each generation. It asks citizens to protect institutions they did not create so that future generations may inherit them. That responsibility belongs to all Americans. The Constitution can provide a framework, the courts can interpret the law, Congress can write legislation. The president can lead the executive branch, but only they. American people can preserve the democratic values upon which the nation was founded. So, as this remarkable week comes to a close, perhaps the most important lesson is not who won or who lost. The lesson is that constitutional government depends upon limits as much as it depends upon power. It depends upon leaders who respect those limits. And above all, it depends upon citizens who understand that democracy is not something we simply inherit. It is something we must actively protect. History will judge this moment not only by the rulings handed down or the political battles fought, but by how Americans responded to them. The Constitution has endured for nearly 2.5 centuries because generations before us chose to defend it. Now that responsibility passes to us. Thank you for watching. If you found this discussion informative, please like, share, and subscribe to Lo Cianaro for more in-depth analysis of politics, history, and world affairs. Stay informed, stay engaged, and I'll see you in the next video.